today. My name's John Terry. I'm an interdisciplinary professorial fellow, which, as Aileen mentioned, means that my role is split across mathematics, computer science, and medicine. That reflects the nature of our research and teaching that looks to bring together techniques from computer science and from mathematics and bring the power of those disciplines to bear in biomedical and clinical sciences. Um, so, in terms of the purpose of today's introduction, I just wanted to talk a little bit about some of my background and how I got really interested in public engagement and the power that public engagement has to inform and shape research. And then, as Aileen mentioned, after lunch, we're having a session where we'll talk a little bit more specifically about our particular ICT projects that have been supported by the EPSRC. So prior to working at the University of Birmingham, I was a professor at the University of Exeter. And as part of a grant made by the Wellcome Trust through its Institutional Strategic Support Fund, we established a centre there which was designed to bring quantitative methodologies and biomedical and clinical research closer together. And as part of that process, we established what we called a research incubator. And the research incubator was kind of inspired by business equivalents, where if you're thinking of starting a venture, there are a number of organizations, quite a few universities offer accelerators that often run incubators, and they bring together expertise from different areas of uh, business and help you understand in a very facilitated way the sorts of challenges you might face, how to overcome them, and really help incubate those early stage ideas into something more tangible. And I was really struck. We took part in one of these types of processes that was called ICURE, Innovation to Commercialization of University Research. And I was really struck by the very different timescales that these sorts of processes operated on. So, having been a career academic up until that point, academic cadence and timing ebbs and flows at a rate that was really quite different to what we were experiencing through this incubator process, where we were tasked with meeting 100 stakeholders, and that included members of the public in a 100-day period. So, we had very strict deadlines in order to achieve outcomes. And what I found interesting was that actually just the process of having these much quicker cadence just enabled you to get a lot more done more quickly. It didn't actually impact on quality. It really just helped drive the thing forward. And I was curious as to whether we could introduce an equivalent into early stage research. The idea being that you would bring together colleagues from different disciplines to focus on a particular research challenge that they'd set themselves, and thinking about how could you actually create an environment that by the end of the process, so 6 or 9 months down the line, you'd established a collaboration that would be in a place to go and apply for funding that would enable that collaboration to continue successfully. And so we put together a number of different facilitated activities, and one of which was a focus on public engagement and involvement. Because we were recognizing even back then that actually engagement and involvement was increasingly being seen as valuable by the major funders. Wellcome at the time were perhaps a bit ahead of the game, but more recently, all of the major funders now recognize the value of public engagement and involvement. But very often, in my experience, colleagues, the organization were not necessarily seeing true value in this. They were often viewing it potentially as what I would term box ticking exercises back in those days. Whereas I wanted to actually think about how can we demonstrate great practice here and actually bring about some cultural change by embedding that public engagement involvement right at the beginning. So, for example, we would do these retreats to kick off these 6 to 9 month projects where we would have the teams come and they would meet these different groups of experts, including in public engagement and involvement in this facilitated way, and to be challenged on what they were doing and to think about ways in which they could better shape the research they were doing to be of interest and relevant to the public, um, as well as receiving help and support in shaping some of the materials that they were developing. Um, and this process grew over time, and the picture you see on the right here was from one of the last ones of these incubators that we conducted. And you can see there's probably around 40 people there. We were supporting 8 or 9 projects, probably 4 or 5 members of the public attending this event, and everyone really felt part of a team that were all looking to uh, drive things forward. And what I was particularly pleased about was the willingness of most of my colleagues to engage productively in this. And on the side of the public members who were supporting us, they were really willing to challenge our colleagues in a really productive way. And this really helped, I think, take research projects to a slightly different level. And in terms of that sort of observation that Aileen mentioned, in terms of the personal commitment being higher than the organizational commitment, I think sometimes, these sorts of activities, if you are in a senior position attending today, I would encourage you to think about ways in which you can help create these sorts of activities that will enable best practice to kind of propagate across your organizations. It does take perseverance. These things grow um, from a starting point, and you've got to be prepared to put the hard yards in. But I think if you're willing to do that, then you can see some great outcomes. And I'll try and just talk a little bit about some of the things that have come out of the activities we've done. If you could go to the next slide, please, Ellie. So as I mentioned, I think one of the primary things here is that you can have better informed research, better outcomes, and better all-round communication from your researchers. And some of the activities that would emerge from these sorts of CCORN projects that we were supporting through the research incubator, for example, we would run focus groups to help the researchers really tease out the really important questions from the point of view of the public. So on the left, top left here, this was a project we conducted down in Exeter that was looking at endocrine conditions and really trying to hone into what were the critical uh, medical outcomes that were really of interest to people with particular endocrine conditions. And this led to a really exciting collaboration between the teams, but also led to a public information video being made that's been seen really quite widely in that particular community. That was a really nice outcome. One of the things why I think it's really important to have those types of activities in your project is that you can get very different perspectives from different groups of stakeholders. So, for example, in my own research field in epilepsy, when we started off, we were mainly working with research active and intensive clinicians, and they would give us a very different perspective on, for example, the journey to diagnosis and the subsequent treatment of someone with epilepsy than would be the case of an individual who had had lived experience of that process. So, for example, in the early days, we were told diagnosis was, pretty straightforward. We're on top of that. We don't really have many challenges there. But prognosis, that's a real challenge for us. And if you could make some progress there, that would be great. But that actually didn't get borne out in the sessions we ran with people with lived experience of that journey. We didn't meet a single person. We might have met one actually, but beyond one, we didn't meet a single person, and we probably conducted interviews with approaching 100 who found that journey to diagnosis satisfactory. They talked about huge uncertainty really long time periods. And once a diagnosis has been reached, being really unclear about what it really meant and how to move forwards from there. And that experience in the early days was again another key driver for me to help encourage colleagues to really work with a whole diversity of stakeholders who might have an interest in your research challenge, because you can really shape what you're looking to achieve by getting that extra information. Um, Another good example of this was we ran an event through the team that was supported by Caroline Gillett and Edda Zavala, which was called the Allies in Advocacy. And what was particularly nice about this event was that it brought together lots of different groups of individuals from different backgrounds to all think about ways in which people could work effectively together to communicate a clearer message, both from a research side, but also from a public engagement and involvement side. And really nice thing here was that we actually had an artist attend this event who, as you can see from the output, was actually drawing in real time some of the key messages that were coming out of the meeting. And I found this really interesting in terms of how a piece of work like this emerges as a result of hearing discussions and listening to people's debates and arguments. And then you can create this really lovely representation of everyone's involvement in a way that I thought really conveyed nicely some of the key outputs of the meeting. Next slide, please, Ali. So as we sort of grew these activities, we actually got a number of different organisations reach out to us, and one of the particularly memorable ones was the Northcote Theatre, which is a theatre situated on the university campus in Exeter. And the artistic director of the theatre at the time, Paul Jepson, got in touch and said he was interested in trying to create new forms of artistic performance that might be suitable for conveying complex ideas from research. Um, and I've always been someone who's been quite keen to explore new ideas, take a bit of a chance, and so I met Paul for a coffee. And we wondered whether or not it might be possible to create some kind of production that would convey our current understanding of how seizures emerge from complex brain networks and how mathematical and computational tools could be used to better interrogate clinical data uh, and hopefully enable better clinical decisions to be made. And this process was a really interesting one. So we had a number of workshops where members of my team and myself would turn up and work with a group of actors, trying to find different ways of conveying and communicating some of the key messages. And what was really interesting was this was kind of a bit like an emergent phenomena, but in action appearing before your eyes. So at the beginning, everyone was a bit like uncertain and we didn't really know what we would do. And there was some, what I would probably have described at the time as slightly peculiar activities where, people would just start singing at each other and echoing back what they heard. But it was really interesting because Paul had really got this idea of networks and how communication flowed in these networks. And what he was doing was trying to find different ways of performance that could enable this concept of kind of information flow from one part of the brain, in this case, an actor, to another part to flow. And whilst this singing piece didn't quite work out in the way imagined, it quickly led to this really interesting approach to improvisation, where, unlike standard improv, where people are given a topic and are just left to get on with things, people were given a topic, but the way in which they could improvise with each other was determined by the network that was imposed. So you can kind of see here these arrows are representing a network, and essentially in this improvisation scenario, it meant that in the conversation, only you could only influence people to come to your way of thinking if there was an arrow from you to them. So, for example, in the top right, Mr. Brain, as this character was called, could influence his daughter, Mrs. Daughter Brain, but not the vice versa. This couldn't happen. You know, if Daughter Brain wanted to influence her father, it had to go through this other part of the network. And what was really interesting was that once the actors got the hang of this, because this is a very different way of doing improvisation, it quickly led to really interesting dynamic phenomena that very nicely mimicked what we were seeing in our computational models of the brain and what you would see in the brain of people with epilepsy in terms of the electrical patterns when they were having seizures. And so we put together ultimately a show that combined testimony from people with lived experience of epilepsy, this improvisation piece, but also information about how the computer models were built up. And we used this improvisation piece to show how you could build up a network. So you'd start off with only two characters and build it up to four and introduce the relationships. And then you encouraged audience participation because by building it up in this way, people quickly got the hang of how the network was working. And so people would come on stage and encourage, different relationships to occur in a bid to see whether they could actually disrupt the sort of dynamic that was building up. And so it was a really interesting way of actually developing people's understanding of these sorts of networks. And we took this show around the country. So we went to 8 theatres across England and Wales, and it showed to around 1,000 to 1,200 people across those theatres. And we got some really great feedback in terms of how it was really able to give people a meaningful insight into A, what it was like to have epilepsy, but B, how you could develop and apply mathematical and computational tools to understand this complex medical problem. And so, if any of you do have the opportunity to speak to people in the performing arts, I'd really encourage it because some of the ideas they bring, like for example, watching this play out in front of me, actually made it easier for me, even as the scientist, to understand why I was seeing certain patterns in the networks that I was observing. Next slide, please. And just sort of finally, for this part of the session, it's one of the things that we've really built on, having seen the power that art can bring, is to run an artist in residence scheme. But we do it slightly differently here in Birmingham. So the research incubator and these projects that we support within it, we now look to bring in an artist to actually be part of the team that develops the project over those 6 to 9 months. And the artist has a specific expectation that they will develop a piece or pieces of artwork that communicate the complexity of the research being developed. But by having them embedded right at the beginning, similar to what I experienced with working with the theatre, we find that often the actual research gets shaped and advanced in really interesting and novel ways by having that different perspective from the artist perspective compared to just having it purely based around quantitative science. And there's just some examples here of a few of the outputs that we've had. And also just to give you a bit of an idea that we've had visual artists, we've had composers, we've had digital artists. We've even had in the last round sort of more sculptures and people doing hard sculpting from rock, which was really interesting as well. And one of the great things about this is that we've been able to actually exhibit these pieces in a couple of in-person shows. And in fact, the very first one we did, unfortunately, was only online because that happened during COVID. But the advantage of that is it's still actually available to be seen. And if anyone's interested, we can send you a link to look at that virtual exhibition. And some of the really nice things about this is that for many of the artists, they've actually gone on to secure additional funding for their own work as a result of being involved in these projects. And very often, actually, we have worked with artists who bring a lived experience perspective of a certain medical condition that we might be working on in one of these projects. So I guess to summarize, a lot of the work we've done has been to try and ensure that there is mutual benefit to the interactions that we have. And I think that's what's absolutely key. You want a relationship that is built uh, in a fair and equitable way between all parties, and that communicating clearly and effectively what each party brings and how each party can expect to benefit uh, is a really important aspect of what I seek to achieve, at least when it comes to public involvement and engagement. So I hope that's given you a bit of a flavour of some of the things we've been up to. As I mentioned, after lunch, we're going to have a session that's more focused, I think, on our specific projects within the ICT Public Engagement Champions domain. But I think for now, Aileen, I will wrap up and let you move into the networking session.